So we are really privileged to have Martin here. Martin studied photography and design in Germany, and then photographic preservation in the States. After that, he had a private practice in Germany, and then since 2010, he worked at the Rijksmuseum in the photographic collection and preservation side. So he published a book in 2009, digital print, on the preservation, a complete guide to process, identification and preservation of contemporary photographs. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Kali, and it's a great pleasure to be here today. I've been told that my name could also be Estonian,
Yes.
but it's not. So I'll be giving this talk in English because I'm half German, half English, and I think English is probably a better choice than German, so I'll stick to English today. So I've been here for a few days now. It's been really wonderful. We've been looking at photographs and talking about photography and digital prints at the Kumu Art Museum. And I was asked to give a public talk today, and I wasn't really sure who would be coming, and I'm very curious now to see how you react to this talk. The title sounds a little bit presumptuous, perhaps. It sounds as if I'm going to give you an answer to that question. Well, of course, I won't be giving you an answer. What I want to do instead is try to look at some of the issues, look at some movements we've been having in the past. So moving into the past, coming towards the present, maybe thinking a little bit about the future of photography, of art, perhaps a little bit in a digital world that still has some analog movements in it. So we'll sort of see where this goes. I'm going to try and explore some of the issues, and we'll see where this really gets us in the end. I work at a museum, at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and I'm there for photograph conservation. This wasn't taken in Amsterdam, but I think what a lot of us probably have in common is that we look at things. And we look at things on walls very often, or we look at things in galleries and on the floor. And this looking at an object, that's something that somebody has made for us to look at. That's really what this talk is about. And I think we all sort of have had that experience and have that experience, but sometimes it's a good question to sort of question that, or it's a good idea to question that experience. So what am I looking at, and why am I looking at it? And what did the person who made that object want me to look at? Those are some of the things I want to explore a little bit, but I'll be sort of looking at the technical side, because I'm a photograph conservator, so I'm responsible for a collection of photographs in the physical manner. So, if I'm at a museum or a gallery, one of the things I like to do is read the labels, because the label is going to give me information about what I'm looking at. I mean, I can look at something, but a label really helps me along. So this is a nice label by a work, Barbara Kruger. We're not seeing the work here. And it's labeled, well, it's got its title, its date, and it's labeled digital photograph. So what would you think a digital photograph is? What is that? What is the physical object? Or is a digital photograph more sort of a theoretic object? Is it something that you actually have in a physical form, in a digital camera, or is it something you have in a physical form on the wall? Those are some interesting questions, I think. How photograph, the term or the concept of photography, has changed since we've moved digital. So here's another object. This is in Amsterdam at the Stedelijk Museum for Contemporary Art. And it's really large. I mean, you can see it's very, very big. And it looks like a photographic image. It looks like a shot of a gallery showing art, but then it's sort of an image of that gallery. So, curious, what is this? Well, the label gives the name of the artist. It's Lewis Lawler from the US. And as a physical medium, this is called digital printing on vinyl. So we know vinyl is a plastic, right? It's kind of plastic. But what is the digital printing? What does that mean? What is it? I mean, it has a photographic image, so it must be something photographic in a way. This is clearly a photograph. So you walk into the next room in the stable, and you're in this gallery suddenly. And the walls and the floors, they're just covered in text. So here again, I'm curious, and so I look at the label, really. And this is by Barbara Kruger. Of course, she often works with text. And this is also digital printing on vinyl. So, in other words, if the object I just saw was a digital print on vinyl, and this one is also a digital print on vinyl, it must somehow be the same physical material. And yet one, let's say, pictorial representation was of photographic quality or nature, and this is just pure text. So apparently with this printing method, I can separate the content from the physical print. And that's interesting to me, because with photography, traditional photography, you didn't really do that. You would photograph something with a camera, perhaps, and you would have in your camera, you would have something light sensitive, a piece of film that would record that light, and that negative was a photograph, if you will. And that you would then print in a darkroom, and you would have a print that was also made on a light-sensitive material, and that was also a photograph. So the photographic material had, as a content, as pictorial content, also a photographic image. But it seems that with digital printing, we can separate content from technique, and that's interesting. So I want to explore that a little bit. So, you see these things everywhere. You just have to sort of open your eyes to them. This is an advertisement for a small corner photo lab on the street. And it says, digital prints, real photos from your digital media. So, what they're offering is, for 15 cents, a digital print. That's what you're buying. But at the same time, they're calling it a real photo. So what is a real photo then? And if something is real and they stress this, then there must be an unreal photo somewhere, or there must be some kind of a photo that's false. It's a little odd, and some of you probably already suspect what this means, but let's explore this a little bit further. So, I mean, I tend to think that I know what photograph means, but digital print is the one that's a little elusive here. So this is at the Amsterdam airport, and you're walking along, you're carrying your bags, and then you see this digital print services. And this is fantastic. I think to myself, okay, I'll finally understand what a digital print is. So you've got at the left, you've got a small photocopier, if you want to photocopy some documents. Next to that, you can print your own business cards. Then you've got a little device that prints your photos in seconds. So you go there with your cell phone, and you make prints of images you've taken with your cell phone, for example. And the fourth one on the right is a booth that takes passport photos. So really, two of these involve photography in a way, and two of them don't. One just makes copies, and the other one prints text. And they all fall under the heading digital print services. So that's interesting. At this point, really, what you should do is open your dictionary and figure out where does the term come from, digital, and print. Where does that come from? So really, if you look at historical uses of the term digital print, this is from 1921, and this is called a telegraphic code for fingerprint formulae and a system for self-classification of single digital impressions. So print and impression really having the same meaning in general. So it has to do with fingerprints here, really. This is another nice source here. The Boston police, in checking their records, discovered that one of the imprints on a murder car tallies exactly with a digital print of John Jones, as shown by the registration made when he violated the traffic law. So really here, the digital print being the print that your finger leaves somewhere, a fingerprint. And of course that's from Latin, right? Digitus, meaning finger or toe. And of course you can count on your fingers, which gives us a numbering system, which is the decimal system because we have 10 fingers. So if we think about digital coming from this Latin word, then it's all about numbers, really. And that's obvious, and we know that, really. Now, we don't really use the decimal system, we use the binary system. And I think all of us know this as well. So zeros and ones, you essentially just have either one state or another state. Now this is very far away from traditional photography. We've really moved a long way, I think. We're talking about numbers that exist electronically. They don't really exist, you can't really touch them anywhere. They're not physical. And yet we have the print element of digital print. So we've got to get that non-physical electronic signal onto something that we can handle and touch. And there are lots of terms for this. So if you start looking into the literature, you find hard copy, computer-generated print, print-out, plot, non-impact print. You also find often in the same sort of discussion photograph, and we'll look into that more, of course. Then you've got different techniques like inkjet prints. Then you have odd words like lambda print and lightjet print, and then some obscure techniques like dye sublimation, and the list really goes on and on and on. So there's a whole world of this connection of the non-physical digital with the physical print. So let's explore this a little bit. That's what I want to do in the next few slides, is see where this takes us, this sort of technical journey. So some of you here, looking around in the audience, might remember the 1980s. And there was a very simple computer language called BASIC. And I had it at elementary school. We had our computer class, and we learned this language. And it was very, very simple. And you would type, you type it on a green screen, and we typed these excellent short programs. This is a very short program here. It ends at the end. Those of you who remember BASIC will probably know what this program did. So when you hooked up your computer to a printer, it printed out this image. It's not very sophisticated, but we can see what it is, right? And it's, of course, the dream of every elementary school boy. Of course, I don't have that dream anymore, right? I mean, who wants to increase? But it's a simple drawing, really. It's made up of individual marks or individual characters. But today I would probably call it a drawing, perhaps a computer drawing. Well, the print we made on a dot matrix printer, and probably some of you remember these as well. They're very loud printers, and they print with text, and they print in a matrix of dots, which gives it the name, of course. And it's very simple, very, very straightforward method of printing. You can also print images that come from a different source, and we printed this in my elementary class as well. So this is actually, this is taken from a scan, and back then we had hand scanners. You would hold it in your hand and you would pull it across a surface. So we essentially hand scanned a photograph and then imported it into the computer and then printed it out. Now, if you look at this really, I mean, you can see it's made up of dots, right? It's from a dot matrix printer, it sort of makes sense. But it's different from the car that we just saw in the sense that it has a certain quality that you might call photographic, which is pushing it a bit, of course, because photographs usually have continuous tone and you can see details and so on. But knowing that it actually is a scan of a photograph that's been translated into dots and then printed by a printer that can only print dots, it still retains that certain quality. And that's an interesting quality that we need to just keep in our minds for a second and think about. You can do lots of other great things with these printers. Now, careful, it's going to get a little bit loud. This is 2004, an installation work with dot matrix printers. I'll just let it run just for a minute or so you get a sense of what it is. So it's sensing 3 dot matrix printers, and they're being filled and projected on the wall. And the great thing about these printers is you can program them to print text, basically. And the way the text that they're printing, if you give them the right text, will give you a certain rhythm. So this is really techno in its purest form, right? And then it's projected on the wall. And this goes on for quite a while. I won't show you the whole video. It's actually very cool. Okay, so really most people at that time were not making music with dot matrix printers, but they were using them in office situations like this. The reason I showed that video is I think it's important to realize that, you know, using devices for what they're meant to be used for is one thing, but actually using them for things they're not meant to be used for is another, and I'll have more examples of that as we move along. So here, these two gentlemen are definitely, this is from 1976, using these devices for what they're supposed to be used for. And I want to show you that one device in the center, which is a line plotter, because that's very specific for the 1970s and 80s. And it's also a very, very interesting type of device. And I've got a film of that as well. So this is a line plotter or pen plotter drawing the space shuttle. And this was used by architects as well for quite a long time. And what it does is essentially, it has a pen, and the pen works on two axes, an X and a Y axis. And it can make drawings, and of course it can draw anything you tell it to draw. So, I mean, this is obviously a drawing, right? But you could imagine using this and programming it to draw something completely different that might actually give you more of a sort of photographic aesthetic, let's say. Just going to move on to the next video. So this is a German technologist or technician who took the picture of the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and drew it on his, or had it drawn on the window of his office. So he devised this pen that's hanging there, and it's essentially pulled by two wheels, and it moves across the surface. And then sometimes it's touching the window, and sometimes it's not. So it's a similar idea, really. It's working on an XY axis, and by jiggling it a little bit, he's getting these darker lines. So here again, we're using a very simple, let's say, digital system to create an image that has something photographic about it, and it's all line-based imagery. Just going to move on. These are really fun. If you start getting into this computer drawing, then it's really hard to get out of it again. 1980s, you find also there's this software called, for example, Mac Paint. It was paint software, and you could really draw anything you want or paint anything you want. And you looked at this on the screen, but you could also print it out. And you needed some form of printer to do this. You could do this, first of all, only in black and white, of course, and then later in color as well. So line-based computer art is very interesting because it really leads toward what we have today, and it's part of the history of what we do today. This is another example. This is by the American artist Michael Null, and this was made in the mid-1960s. It's kind of hard to see here, so I've got a detail of that piece of film. This is actually black and white microfilm, and what you're looking at is random lines that have been exposed onto this film, and then the film is developed. So here actually we're looking at a photographic material, which is black and white microfilm. So it's actually light sensitive, but the image itself does not really remind us of a traditional camera-based photograph. So here again, I'm thinking about content of what we're seeing and material that we're using in order to show that content. And if you look at the device that he used, this is the exposure device really. So the digital information came on those magnetic reels that you see. And then in the center, you see that door is open, and really what you're looking at is a cathode ray tube. It's a very simple type of screen, if you will. And on top of that tube, then there's a camera with film. So it's essentially just photographing in the dark when you close the door, photographing the screen, which is generating lines of light. So it is a true photograph in that sense. It's an image created by light. And so are the next ones here. In the copy art movement, 1970s, 1980s was sort of the best time for copy art. We're looking here at Sonia Lennon Sheridan. She's a Canadian artist, and at that time she was working with photocopiers, which had entered the market 15 years before. In 1960, the first photocopier entered the market. But what she did was she thought about what a photocopying machine actually does, or what it's meant to do. And that is, in the office situation, is to take a document and create a copy of that document. And the idea being that the copy should be exactly the same as the document itself. And not just one copy, but you could actually make lots of copies. You could make multiples. So you would go from the original to the multiple copies. And she decided to change that and turn that system around. So she would lay down flowers and objects on top of the photocopier. And then she would turn on the copier, and while it was copying, this is a color copier, she would shine colored lights in through the glass at the top. So every print that came out was essentially a unique print and not a copy of something that was original. You know, it sounds very simplistic today, really. But in fact, at that time, it was really revolutionary to essentially go against the industry and be subversive and change the function and meaning of a machine like that. At the same time, it's interesting because she's working with light. And if we think about the word photocopy, we've got the term light in there, of course, photo, which of course means light. Other artists worked with photocopiers. This is Klaus Orbons, a German copy artist who was very prolific, and he's copying a human being here. It's called human one-to-one, so he's copying this person in segments, and it's kind of a church altar. It's a whole performance piece right here. You also find people playing around, of course, making self-portraits. You know, this looks kind of silly, really, if you think about it today. But again, at that time, it really wasn't silly. I mean, they were earnest about this. You can see in the background there the hands playing around with different body parts. And those of you who know the work of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy might be reminded of his photograms, which he made, which really have a very, very similar aesthetic to those prints in the background back there. David Hockney was very interested in any new type of technological device, and he bought photocopiers and he played around with them. And he made a self-portrait here, which is made up of two A4 color photocopies. His head being a copy of a pencil drawing that he made, or a color drawing that he made, and then an actual photocopy of his shirt. So he's bringing together the three-dimensional and the non-technical, let's say, the artist's hand, together into one new layer, which is actually simply a photocopy. And of course, he could make multiples out of this. So he's interested here again in the original and the copy. Today, we have a much more sophisticated way of making self-portraits, and that's the selfie toaster. I'm not sure if anyone has one here at home, but they're really fantastic. So, you know, that's the state of technology today. Just going back to David Hockney again, he was interested, like I said, in originals and duplicates, and he also used the fax machine. Now, the fax machine is a thing of the past. Nobody really uses fax anymore. Which is kind of sad because it had a very special aesthetic. And the fax, remember, worked with a thermal paper and not with the light-sensitive paper. So using heat instead of light, which is kind of interesting because if you think about it, heat is just an extension of light. They're both forms of energy. They're just at different wavelengths, really. So it's still using a form of wavelength, a form of energy to create an image. And here David Hockney made a drawing of a painting which was a painting of another painting. And then he faxed his drawing. So you've got various layers of original duplicate going on in one object, which is interesting. Now, when I was a student of photography in the 1990s in Germany, Wolfgang Tillmans, the German photographer and artist, was really sort of on the rise, and he was becoming very popular, and we were all big fans of Wolfgang Tillmans. So we all wanted to do the same thing as he was doing, of course. And it was really in at the time to take a color print and then enlarge it on a color photocopier and just make it larger and larger and glue the sheets together and then just tape them on the wall. Of course, it was cheaper as well than making color prints ourselves. Remember, this is sort of the era before inkjet really took off, and we didn't have any inkjet printers at the time. So here again, photocopies as a way of multiplying, in this case, a photographic original, a photographic image. So it's taking that photographic information and translating it into a new aesthetic. And these are also very interesting aesthetics. Medical imaging, if you think about how these images are made. So the one on the right is an ultrasound of a pregnant woman, and the one on the left is a computer tomography. And both of them are made essentially out of electronic signals. So one is, of course, the ultrasound. The device that registers this information receives the sound waves and translates them into an electronic signal, which is then translated into a pictorial image so that we can see it. Whereas on the left, really, we have another form of an electronic signal coming back from the computer tomography device. And that, again, has to be translated into something visual that we can then hold in our hands. So we're looking at different ways of generating images here. And what's interesting to me here is that the right one is a thermal paper, so again, it's generated by heat, whereas the left one is actually a black and white silver gelatin film, so it's completely photographic in its nature of material, physical manifestation, but not in the imagery, because we really couldn't have taken these pictures in any way with light. Now, what's really important is, of course, inkjet, and we can't have any talk today about photography and not talk about inkjet. So inkjet really becomes popular, or starts becoming popular in the early 1980s, but it's only in 1990, 1995 that photographers start thinking about using inkjet printers on a professional level, and then it's only in around 2000 when the first pigment-based inks appear on the market. And everything before 2000, you know, let's say, wasn't really giving you the high quality that you wanted. And everything after 2000 was suddenly becoming really serious, serious business, let's say, serious inkjet print. And that's where marketing is interesting. And, you know, you see I'm sort of jumping around a bit here, but actually marketing is super interesting. If you look at advertisements, look at how the businesses and the industry were trying to sell materials in the past. It gives you a great idea of where we are, or why we are at the position we are today. So this is from the late 1990s, an advertisement. I'm not going to go through all of it, but just a couple of things I think are interesting. This is an advertisement for an inkjet paper by the company Ilford. And we all know that Ilford is having a really hard time now. And if we just look at the headline, introducing the only desktop paper that looks and feels just like a photo. So imagine, late 1990s, you still have the photographic industry going strong, right? Fuji, Kodak, Agfa, and people are still printing out photographs at home. Not at home, but to have at home. So photographs from your holidays, photographs of your families. All of these things are still being printed and passed around during coffee breaks and so on, pasted into albums. Of course, we don't really do that anymore. But at that time, the inkjet industry said, this is the market we want to get into. Now, the only way they could get into that market was by producing materials that looked and felt just like a traditional photo. And what's the feeling about it? Well, it doesn't only have to look like a traditional photo, but you also have to be able to handle it and touch it, the physicality. So it has to be heavy, a heavyweight paper. It has to be glossy, right? A glossy photograph. That's the feel. You have to be able to feel that it feels like a traditional color print. And that's why I like this advertisement. It's not just about aesthetics, it's about physical properties. And you know, it's interesting to read the whole text, we don't need to do that now, but it's all about, you know, photographic weight, glossy surface, water-fast coating, traditional photo, optimized to maximize the fade resistance. So all these things, everything that becomes important for inkjet to actually become successful in the field of photography and art is in one advertisement, in one short text. You just sort of have to understand it and look back into it. And in fact, you do see people at that time, they do start printing out inkjet prints at home and they put them in albums, but really nobody did this very seriously, and you don't find a lot of that. I think the industry really invested a lot in the amateur market and figured out at some point that we just weren't printing out our photos. Looking at some other advertisements, this is a favorite of mine. This is also, this is around the year 2000. This is for a dye sublimation printer, which the company calls a digital photo printer. So here really, as in the advertisement we just saw, the digital printing industry is saying, the print that you're producing with our technology is a photograph. And that's something I'm going to question in a minute. But I just wanted to show this because of the fuzzy animals. And it is a selling point, right? It still is. I mean, what are the videos that are the most successful on the internet, right? We don't know. So at that time, around 1991, 1992, and within the years that followed, artists and photographers got really serious about making inkjet prints. It all started with one company in Los Angeles using the Iris printer. But then other printers came along, Epson and Hewlett-Packard got much better and offered professional solutions. And you tended to have this, this is especially in the 1990s, early 2000s, you had this traditional sort of aesthetic to a print. So you see, you know, the artist or photographer would collaborate, well, artist or photographer, some of you will object, let's say artist and or slash photographer, depending on what your personal feelings are. So you would collaborate with a professional printmaker, and in fact at that time the first sort of editions that were coming on the market were very, very traditional. So they were printed on this sort of rough fine art etching paper. They had a white border, you have the blank stamps of the printmaker, you've got the edition number written in pencil. You know, all of this very, very traditional form of creating editions that we know from silkscreen printing and woodblock printing and etchings and lithographs and so on. Now, of course, that did hold for a while, and it's still being done, but it's become less popular now. That's my feeling. Now you see a lot more, let's say, the cold material, glossy matte papers, RC papers. You don't have that fine art, let's say, rough edge of the paper anymore. So things have changed a bit since the 1990s. And this is 2006, during a workshop that we were having, where professional photographer Terry Evans was showing us the prints that she makes using inkjet. And her main argument at the time for inkjet and against photographic prints was that she could make them herself, that she had become independent of the photo laboratories. Now, of course, that whole movement towards printing yourself made a lot of photo labs close. So it really changed the whole business aspect of professional photography. This is a good question. And you know, what we can do is, when we have that question, we can look at the literature. I mean, there's lots and lots of technical literature. So if you start doing that, you find some of these are the processes that you find most often mentioned. We've looked at dot matrix, exposure to silver halide. So silver halide is a photographic paper, it could be black and white or color. Exposure is then using a laser or an LED array, just exposing that material and developing it. Direct thermal, that's your fax material. Direct thermal transfer is similar, but with an extra transfer step. Electrophotography being laser prints and photocopies. Inkjet, of course, we all know. Dye diffusion thermal transfer is also called dye sublimation. So I'm going through this kind of quickly, it doesn't really matter. What you can see is there are lots and lots and lots of different ways to print out digital signals in a pictorial or non-pictorial way. I could use any of these to either print out a photographic image or just text. It doesn't really matter. And that's the interesting thing here about the digital printing. As long as you come from a direct digital signal, whatever you print is independent of which technique you choose to print it. Now, because this can be a little confusing, what conservators have done is put together sample collections. So we just collect prints, we print our own samples, and this is one sample collection I'm showing you here. These are some interesting websites associated with this sample collection. And they help you understand what these prints look like and why they look the way they look. And it also helps you understand, in a museum environment, that if you acquire a new print from an artist, let's say, and you don't really know what the technology is, you can't identify it, well, you can always go back to your sample collection and essentially compare them. And this will really help you. So these are very interesting. If you, for example, enlarge, I'm just enlarging the area of this eye now on one sample, and then you enlarge the same area of the eye on another sample, you can see that they look very, very different. So using a microscope here, you can essentially see that the top one has a screen pattern, and the bottom one doesn't. But the bottom one has some very strange lines going on, and it's a little bit grainy. And so the idea of these sample collections is to start understanding the diversity and the different aesthetics of the different printing processes. So I've been collecting prints since 1998, and I've got about 300 in my collection now. And having a collection is nice, but if you're the only one who has access to it, it's not much use really. So this year I put my collection online, and I'm showing the magnified eye from about 200 of the 300 prints online. The idea is that you can start comparing, and of course they're sorted, you can sort them yourself and so on. But you can start comparing and you can understand, so an inkjet print typically looks like this, but there are also some exceptions, and sometimes inkjet looks like this. And if I compare inkjet to dye sublimation, I see that there's a big difference because of this and this. So this is the website. Have a look at it if you like. It's kind of it's not a didactic website, it's an aesthetic website. And it's all about sort of thinking about that idea of the physical carrier and the image, and so the content and the physical material. I like thinking of those categories and seeing how they work together. Now, if you have a sample collection, what you can also do is start cutting it up. So essentially what you're doing is you're making cross-sections. So we've been cutting these prints and then looking at the edge under a microscope. And this really helps you understand how these prints are made. For example, if we just compare these two cross-sections here, on the bottom one we see it's kind of a complex paper material with some other layers on the bottom and on the top. And on the top we have 3 layers, yellow, magenta, cyan, and then there's a protective transparent layer on top. And the top cross-section really shows you just a simple sheet of paper and the colorant sitting on top of that, but not actually penetrating into the paper. So here again, the cross-sections help you understand the structure. And here also, the more cross-sections you make, the more you start understanding what these prints are made of. And believe me, the cross-section is the key to understanding the aesthetics of a print. So the cross-section determines saturation of your color, it determines sharpness of your image, it determines gloss and sheen, it determines the weight of your print. All of these things can be read out of these cross-sections. You just sort of have to learn how to read them. These can all be found on this website, graphicsatlas.org, which is really fantastic. It's produced by the Image Permanence Institute in Rochester, New York, and it really gives you a good idea of digital printing, and it connects the contemporary printing to historic printing. So historical processes are also on that website. And you can really take your time to explore this a little bit. So we've thought about different processes, we've sort of explored a little bit of the history, we've thought about sample collections, the idea of content versus physicality. Let's look at some labels. Let's get back to these labels, because the label is, for a museum, is probably the most important way to communicate with the visitor. I mean, obviously, the objects are the real communication. But as I said at the beginning, often you'll find an object by itself can be enjoyed, but it can't be fully understood. You need some context. That's what we find, at least at the Rijksmuseum. So, looking at these labels, and I've got just a small selection from different galleries here. It's interesting. This is the artist Anouk Kruithof. The work is called Stress Frustrated, purple. And the technique is ultra-chrome print / diasec. So, if you open any book on the technology of photography, you won't find either of these terms. If you open any book on, digital printing, you probably won't find any of these terms. These are not technical terms. These are proprietary brand names. Ultrachrome being an ink that Epson produced, and diasec is a licensed process for adhering photographs to plexiglass. So it's a little confusing for people who don't really know what this is. Now, of course, you can always educate yourself, but it's not communicating in a way that makes it easy for the visitor, I think. Here's another one by Amina Ben Ujda. I'm not precisely sure how to pronounce her name. The work is called Rabbit Hole, and the technique is C-print on Hahnemühle Fine Art Baryta. And for me, this is a little confusing as well, because C-print, if you look at that term historically, it comes from a certain paper that Kodak produced, which was the C-type paper. And that was a very popular paper, and it was a color photographic paper. It was very popular, so the name caught on, and it started to become a synonym for color print, or chromogenic print, which is photographic material. So C-print has a kind of long history, and it's had lots of different meanings. But here it doesn't work, because the Hahnemühle Fine Art Baryta is actually a paper made for inkjet by the company Hahnemühle, which is a German mill. And the Fine Art Baryta indicates that it's actually a fiber-based paper that imitates the paper used for black and white fiber-based printing, because it has a layer of barium sulfate. So if we say that the C print, which is typically used for a photographic material, is printed on Hanimula Variety, then that doesn't work because it's physically not possible. So probably C print means color print here, which is a little odd because if you look at the print, you can see it's in color. So you see where I'm going. It just doesn't really work, and I think we can do better. So this one is a Recom Diatone print. Here again, really you have to use Google to understand what this is. So Recom is a German company based in Stuttgart, and they make inkjet prints. And they've given a brand name to their inkjet prints, which they call Diatone prints. And they're really beautiful prints. But it's a little confusing here again. It's not educative in that sense, or it doesn't really help you. It doesn't help you along. I have to show another example, of course, to redeem the label. So this is again at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, and you see someone's looking here at this large work here, and it just says inkjet on paper. It's very clear. Everybody knows what this is. It's ink, essentially, on a sheet of paper. Very simple. Now, as such, of course, ink on paper is essentially a print. It's a type of printing, right? All traditional printmaking techniques, like the lithograph, like etching, engravings, all of those are ink on paper, essentially. The only difference here is that the ink has been jet. We saw the dots. So the ink has been thrown or sprayed at the paper. It's not applied to the paper from a physical master. So would this be a photograph? It's hard to say. I mean, the image looks quite photographic. So if the image looks photographic, why not call the whole thing a photograph? Well, it's hard for me to do that, I have to be honest, because it's ink on paper. And this print here was never light sensitive. I might be splitting hairs, but I think it's important to look at those hairs and question whether we should split them or not, and not just take it for granted. Now, because this is all a little bit confusing, what museums have been doing for the past probably 5 years is using a form. So at our museum and at many other museums, when we acquire a contemporary work of art that is related to photography in some way, we use this photograph information record. And you can't read it here, but it doesn't really matter. The idea is, at the moment that we acquire the work in our collection, we ask the artist to give us all of the technical information related to that work, including the process. So, is it an inkjet print? If so, which ink was used and on which paper was the print made? Were there any other treatments? Was it lacquered? Was it mounted to aluminum? All these things. Because in the future, we may not be able to get that information anymore. And if we don't have the information, we won't know if this print is light sensitive or not light sensitive. We may not be able to show it. We may not be able to give it on loan to other museums. And of course, that's our core function, is to show work and to loan work to other museums. So we want to show it, but we also want to preserve it. We have that dilemma at a museum that it's our mandate to preserve and it's our mandate to show. And those are two things that often don't match. So the more information we have on the technical side about a work, the bigger the chances that we can actually show it. Now also let's remember that there's this language question. I've been speaking in English the whole time. In Amsterdam, of course, we do everything in Dutch. And here, of course, you do things in Estonian. And actually during our workshop, we were thinking about the Estonian terms and the English terms, and some German terms slipped in there, here and there. And that's an issue, and I know language can be very tricky sometimes. And I've been to Laos and worked at monasteries where there are photographic archives, and in Lao, there's no photographic terminology whatsoever. So here, we're looking at negatives, and I'm trying to explain what a negative is. And it's very, very difficult, of course, to explain. Obviously, I don't speak Lao, but with a translator and with a bit of English that works. These young monks are trying to figure out what a negative is, whereas all they've had really is their cell phones from the very beginning. So language is an issue. Well, if we're talking about language, let's get back to the question that we started out with. So recently, as we all know really, traditional analog photography has been declining. The business has been has been declining, the business side of it, and less people are using it. Initially, incidentally, today I saw at the market here, I saw a young woman opening a camera bag and putting in the film, putting that bit of film into the school, and I was really surprised. I haven't seen that for years. I don't know if it's popular here, but in the Netherlands, nobody does that anymore.
The Riga we opened the new analog lab.
Okay.
So it's starting with a new video.
Okay. No, excellent. Okay, that's interesting. So there is a revival of this, and it's interesting to see. This was a little shocking to me when I read this. So this is from the States. Many film processing services no longer return your original film. So that means you take in your film to get prints made, and all you get is the prints back and maybe a CD with the file, with the scans or digital files. That's kind of shocking because they're really, and if you don't ask specifically for the film back, they're just going to throw it away. That's a little shocking, but that's also because maybe I'm old-fashioned and I have this idea of the past and so on. So it's a trend that we're seeing. And the interesting thing I think about today is that we're sort of in a digital world, and yet some people say that we're in a post-digital world. These are two very, very good books. One is called Post-Digital Print, and the other is called Post-Digital Printing. One of them, the one on the left, is sort of a history of printing since 1894. It's very easy to read and very, very interesting read as well. And the right one is more about hybrid techniques of printing with traditional techniques, but at the same time including a digital facet to that, and introducing artists who are doing this. For me, what's interesting for me about this term post-digital, and the way I understand it is that we've gone, since everything is digital today, every component of our life has some digital element to it today, that it's so obvious or it's so normal that it's digital, we don't have to talk about it anymore. So we're essentially already in the post-digital era, and we're seeing what's going to come next, basically, or seeing how that digital will evolve, but because it's there anyway, we don't really have to talk about it. Now, of course, I've been doing the opposite today, we just start talking about it all the time. But, when you leave this room, just start thinking about which aspects of your life are not in some way digital anymore. And I bet you'll have a hard time finding those aspects. So the post-digital world, the post-digital print, of course, you'll always have a backlash, which is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. So here, for example, this is another exhibition label, and this artist named her print an analog silver gelatin print. And that was the first time I had seen this a couple of years ago, and I thought, wow, so we really have to say that it's analog now, whereas of course we used to just say it's a silver gelatin print. For me, that's interesting, that we're stressing now that it's special in that sense. Now, of course, here we also have to be honest with ourselves, and this is also a marketing term, right? Because if you want to sell something, it's going to have to be special. And in today's world, if something is analog, it's special, not if it's digital. So this is, of course, a way of saying, my print is different than all the other prints, so buy me. And that's not a bad thing. Of course, we need to sell and buy things. I'm just saying, it's important to keep this market idea, which I talked about earlier as well, just sort of in our heads when we're talking about photography and art markets. One more example. Impossible project, you may have heard of this. This is also in the Netherlands, a Polaroid plant that ceased production in 2008, essentially closed down. And they had, of course, all the machinery there, and a lot of the things were available. And they were really going to tear everything down. And so a group of young people got together and said, you know what, let's reinvent the Polaroid. Let's use the same machines. We can't use the same chemistry because Polaroid has all the patents, so we can't use those. But let's reinvent it. And they were basically told, that's impossible, you can't do that. It's too complex. So they called themselves the Impossible Project, and now actually they're doing quite well. They're selling these materials. They were very clever because their new instant materials fit in the old Polaroid cameras. So you don't have to buy a new camera, you can use your old camera. And it's an interesting project, and they have factory tours. You can go there and you can see how it works. It's really very, very interesting. All of the technology is from the 1970s and 1980s. Now, I'm coming to an end, but I think we have to think about one thing. And I've mentioned it a few times already, and this really sums it up, I think. So this is notes by John Herschel, who was one of the inventors of photography in England, and on 14th of March 1839 he wrote in his notebook, "Note on the art of photography, or the application of the chemical rays of light to the purpose of pictorial representation." And this is, as far as we know today, the first time the term photography appeared. So Herschel really was the inventor of this term. And of course, being an English scientist and genius, really, he knew Greek. And that's, of course, where photography comes from, photos meaning light, and graphene meaning to write. So writing with light, essentially. And he also understood that light had a chemical effect, an effect on light-sensitive materials, on silver halide crystals. So if the term photography comes from this generation of a pictorial image by light, well, you know, who are we to sort of change that term? I mean, obviously, photography has changed and evolved over the past 180 years, and that's an interesting thing, and that's a good thing as well. But shouldn't we still sort of give the term photography the honor of being light-bound in some way, because it's in the word itself? So where I'm trying to go really with this is saying, well, is an inkjet print actually a photograph, or is it a print of a photograph? You know, here again, think of the hairs and splitting them, but it's an interesting thought, and it's something that I think we might start thinking about. You know, what is an inkjet print? Maybe the next talk in 10 years will not be what is a photograph, but what is an inkjet print? I'm not sure. Just some food for thought. So some of the challenges I think we'll be facing here is, you know, we're still at one foot in the analog world, but we're sort of losing our foothold there. And we're completely in digital already, but, you know, because we're already submerged in digital, we're sort of moving along and seeing where we're going from there. So while we're still here in this digital analog sort of mix-up, it makes sense to think about technologies. How are people printing and how have they been printing? What were the processes they were using? Think about the materials. You know, this ink, that ink, this paper, you have dye-based inks, pigment-based inks. Which ones are more light-sensitive? Which ones will be more stable? The coatings, should I use a paper with optical brighteners, without? And all these questions. Think about terminology. What am I calling my prints? You know, should I call them photographs? Should I call them photographic prints? Should I call them inkjet prints? Or should I call them, you know, prints in ink of a photographic image? Nobody would do that, of course, right? Sometimes when we're confused, we look to standards and recommendations, but really this field is still developing, so that's a little difficult. And it may take another 10 or 20 years until we've all calmed down a little bit. And I think what's important is to collaborate and discuss. And essentially that's what we're doing here. Well, we haven't been discussing much, I've been talking a lot. But we're welcome to discuss in a second, if you like. Between various disciplines, I'm a conservator, I work in a museum. I'm sure some of you are curators, artists, photographers. You may have different ideas or other ideas. And finally, really to keep up to date, you know, just see what people are doing, check what other people are doing. I mean, obviously here with the exhibition and the story above, that's keeping up to date already. But it's interesting to read technical literature on these printing processes as well, and I would recommend doing that. So those are some of the thoughts I had for today. I didn't really give any answers, I hope, but I just tried to illuminate some ideas, some questions, and we'll see where we go from there. So thank you very much for your attention. And